Daniel Raines had always believed in structure, not just in his work, where he'd spent over 3 decades building one of the most reliable supply networks in the region for ergonomic furniture, but in his daily life. The neat arrangement of his drawers, the precision with which he balanced his books each month, the quiet pride he took in things functioning as they should. After selling his business at 58 and entering what others would call early retirement, Daniel didn't feel the urge to travel the world or buy a boat like some of his former colleagues. Instead, he wanted calm. Intentional, well-structured calm. That's why he had chosen this building. Not just any downtown condo, but a residential high-rise known for its stability, well-managed operations, and zero-tolerance policy for disruption. The building, a converted 1950s institutional complex now hailed as a model of luxury urban renewal, stood just a few blocks from Daniel's favorite independent grocer and a 20-minute walk from the Central Library. Its gray stone facade had the quiet dignity of something that had seen time pass without being consumed by it. Inside, the lobby gleamed with polished walnut panels, ambient lighting that didn't assault the senses, and marble floors that hummed softly underfoot. It was not flashy, and that was the point. It was clean, consistent, and above all, calm. Daniel closed on the unit on the 21st floor without so much as a counteroffer. It was a 2-bedroom corner layout with long south-facing windows and a kitchen designed with utility in mind. The previous owner had left behind high-quality blinds, custom-built shelves, and a few signs of compulsive neatness that Daniel not only respected, but welcomed. From the first night he slept well, waking not to construction noise or errant dogs, but to silence broken only by the soft hum of the HVAC system. No disruptions, no chaos. Exactly what he had wanted. In the first few days after moving in, Daniel avoided the social mixers and community chats the front desk receptionist cheerfully informed him about. It wasn't that he disliked people. He simply saw no reason to engage in unnecessary interactions with strangers, particularly in a building where peace was so clearly maintained through professionalism and rules. He greeted staff when appropriate, tipped the maintenance supervisor after the appliance check, and read the community guidebook from front to back like he would any operations manual. Then came the first encounter with her. It happened on the 3rd afternoon, as Daniel was returning from a walk and approached the elevator. A woman, mid-60s, perfectly coiffed with a burnt orange scarf tied precisely around her neck, stood already inside the elevator. She was holding the door with a firm hand and gave him a tight, practiced smile, the kind that looked more like a reflex than a greeting. "You're new," she said, not asked, as he stepped in and pressed his floor button. Daniel nodded politely. "Just moved into 2113. The woman blinked slowly, as if processing that information required verification. "That's a quiet floor. Mostly long-term owners. I'm on 2105, Karen Lynch." She didn't extend a hand. Her posture remained stiff, almost performative. "Have you filled out your integration form?" Daniel furrowed his brow. "I submitted all my paperwork to the property manager. Lease documents, ID verification, ownership confirmation. Everything was finalized 2 weeks ago." Karen shook her head ever so slightly. No, I mean the community integration form. It's not mandatory, technically, but those of us who manage the building's rhythm, well, we find it helps us avoid surprises." "I wasn't made aware of anything like that," Daniel said calmly. "You wouldn't be," she replied, glancing at the elevator panel as the floors ticked upward. "The building changes hands slowly. We prefer to keep things predictable." She looked back at him. "You'll find it easier here if you engage with the group." Daniel didn't ask what the group meant. The doors opened on his floor, and he nodded again with the same courtesy he offered any neighbor. Have a good day." As the doors closed behind him, her expression didn't change. It was a strange encounter, but Daniel had experienced stranger during decades of dealing with vendors, suppliers, and bureaucrats. He didn't think much of it until the following week, when he received a neatly printed note in his mailbox. No stamp, no envelope. Just a folded sheet on thick paper. Inside, in soft gray ink, were the words, "Please complete your integration form by Friday. Copies are available at the Level 3 committee desk." No name, no logo, just the soft implication of expectation. He ignored it. The second note arrived folded in thirds with sharper handwriting. Participation fosters harmony. Unresponsive tenants destabilize the ecosystem. Daniel read it over twice and slid it into his desk drawer without a word. He didn't mind the passive-aggressive tone. He just didn't appreciate being treated like a foreign element in a building he legally owned part of. Karen began to appear more often. So, in the lobby, in the fitness center, once even standing near the building's mailroom without a parcel in hand. Always just observing. She never accused, never demanded. But her eyes scanned Daniel like she was waiting for him to step out of line. A less structured man might have dismissed it as petty neighborhood politics, but Daniel knew when he was being profiled. The pattern was precise. Slight administrative irregularities began to surface. The online portal for booking guest parking failed to recognize his credentials. One evening, the laundry room fob access denied him entry for no discernible reason. When he inquired at the front desk, they politely explained it was probably a minor glitch. It always was. There was something else, too. Staff who had initially been courteous became hesitant around him, like they'd been coached not to speak too freely. A doorman who used to greet him by name began simply nodding. The building manager, a bright and nervous man named Leo, stopped replying to emails and instead sent generic auto-responses to simple questions. Daniel, however, didn't panic. He documented. Quietly, privately, methodically. He kept logs, screenshots, date-stamped notes of interactions. He didn't ask for confrontation, didn't complain in the resident forum, didn't even bring it up with the other tenants. He simply observed, just as she had. But what triggered what followed wasn't some petty violation of protocol. It wasn't his quiet resistance or refusal to sign some unofficial pledge of allegiance. It was something far simpler. One afternoon, Daniel buzzed in a local courier who had mistakenly brought a package meant for another unit. The man thanked him, smiled, and left. Nothing unusual. But Karen had been watching from the adjacent mezzanine. Within 48 hours, Daniel's building credentials were invalidated, and he was flagged as a potential security concern. The real escalation began there, and when it did, it wasn't loud or public. It was legal, and Daniel Raines, calm, quiet, and always prepared, knew exactly how to respond. Daniel had been through enough contract disputes and vendor arbitrations in his professional life to understand the rhythm of pressure. First came the subtle encroachments, the hinted authority, the bureaucratic smokescreens. Then, when one didn't yield, came the escalation. Not immediate, but deliberate, calculated to feel like coincidence. But Daniel didn't believe in coincidences. Not in buildings where every key fob swipe and elevator access log was recorded and stored. So, when his access suddenly failed on a Thursday afternoon, right as he returned from a meeting with his accountant, he didn't assume it was a glitch. He had parked in the underground garage as usual, used his key fob to pass the turnstile, only it didn't register. The red light blinked twice, the gate remained locked, and the automated voice calmly repeated, "Access denied." He tried again, waited, tried a different turnstile. Same result. A line began to form behind him. A delivery man shifted impatiently with a dolly of bottled water, and Daniel, calm as ever, stepped aside and called the front desk. No answer. He waited, tried again. On the third attempt, a clipped voice finally picked up. Yes, this is Ashley. How can I help you? Hi, this is Daniel Rains from 2113. My access key isn't working. I'm at the garage turnstile. There was a pause. Not long, but unmistakable. Can you confirm your unit again? He repeated it. That's odd. One moment. Music played softly. Daniel didn't move. He looked at the mounted camera, raised an eyebrow as if asking it silently whether this, too, was being recorded. Ashley came back. There seems to be a temporary hold on your credentials. I'm going to need you to proceed to the main lobby. Security will assist you. A hold? For what reason? Daniel asked flatly. I'm not authorized to discuss that over the intercom, sir. Please proceed to the lobby. He didn't argue. He took the elevator to the ground floor, exited the garage, and walked into the lobby where two security guards, not the usual concierge, were waiting. One of them, the taller of the two, early 40s, clearly uncomfortable, asked for identification. Daniel presented his driver's license. I'm going to have to ask you to wait here while we verify your information, the guard said. There's been a report of unauthorized access activity linked to your fob. Daniel looked him in the eye. Unauthorized access to my own residence? We've been instructed to hold all inquiries for building management, the guard said, shifting his weight. I understand this is inconvenient. It escalated quickly after that. 10 minutes later, a patrol unit from the local precinct pulled up. One officer approached Daniel and explained with bureaucratic calm that there had been a complaint filed by a resident alleging that Daniel had been allowing non-residents into the building using his credentials. A possible security breach. The officer was respectful, even apologetic. But protocol, he explained, required them to escort Daniel to the station for formal questioning. Under what charge? Daniel asked. None yet. This is just preliminary detainment for verification, the officer said. If your ID checks out and there's no issue, you'll be free to go within the hour. It was almost surreal. Daniel did not raise his voice, didn't resist, didn't demand to speak to a lawyer. He simply nodded, complied, and allowed himself to be taken in for processing. The ride was short, the questions routine, but the entire event was deeply calculated. He wasn't held in a cell. Instead, he sat in a bland interview room for nearly 4 hours while officers rotated in and out, casually asking about the building, his background, his visitors. He remained factual, courteous, precise. When they finally released him, the officer in charge apologized again. It's probably a misunderstanding. We have to follow up on complaints from private residential boards. Their protocols are separate from ours, but we're obligated to process reports. You understand. Daniel said nothing, took the discharge form, and stepped out into the early evening light. And his car had been towed, temporarily relocated due to a garage maintenance conflict, according to the desk clerk he called. It would be available the next morning. For now, he took a rideshare home, stepped through the main entrance with a temporary paper guest pass handed to him by the same concierge who now refused to meet his eyes, and took the elevator to his floor in silence. But when he reached his door, he noticed something else. His nameplate, the small metallic placard next to his doorbell that had said D. Rains, was gone. In its place was a temporary blank tag, like the kind used during vacancy between owners. Inside his unit, everything was untouched. The air was still cool, the lights still on their timers. But something had shifted. Not physically, not overtly, but there was an unmistakable charge in the atmosphere. The sense that the walls had eyes, that the silence was not natural, but imposed. He sat at his desk, opened his notebook, and began writing. Not a complaint, not a rant. Just a record. Time of detainment, nature of the complaint, interactions with staff, surveillance notes. Witnesses. Each entry dated timed and signed with a level of discipline that would have made a paralegal nod in approval. The next morning, he received 2 letters. The first was slid under his door, a thick white envelope with no sender. Inside was a typed notice from the building's administration stating that his guest privileges had been temporarily suspended pending review of conduct. No citation of specific violations. No opportunity for defense. Just a signature from the Compliance Committee chair, Karen Lynch. The second was a sealed notice placed in his mailbox. It was an invitation to a conflict mediation meeting, scheduled for Friday morning at 9:15 a.m. in the third-floor community room. He was advised to arrive punctually and alone. Daniel did not attend. Instead, he instructed his attorney, a meticulous, well-spoken man who had helped Daniel negotiate the sale of his company 2 years prior, to formally request a meeting with the building's legal counsel. The response came 2 days later. The board sees no legal need to respond to resident attorneys for matters of administrative conduct. That same day, Daniel's parking spot was reassigned. Temporarily, the email said, due to maintenance. When he arrived that evening, someone else's car, a compact SUV with an owner tag reading K. Lynch, sat squarely in his numbered space. He took a photo, then parked in a visitor space and emailed the image to his lawyer. Then he waited, not passively. He continued his notes, made appointments, contacted third-party building access consultants to request records on his fob usage under the pretense of security evaluation, and began to quietly gather information about the board, structure, voting rights, and property management policies. But he did not confront. He did not knock on Karen's door, did not demand apologies, and certainly did not raise his voice in the lobby. He understood that the game being played was not about rules. It was about control. And control, Daniel knew better than most, was never seized through noise. It was acquired through pressure. Quiet, legal, undeniable pressure. And now, they had made a mistake. They had triggered his attention, and Daniel Raines, once merely a quiet resident in a clean high-rise, was about to become their problem. It had been exactly 12 days since Daniel Raines had been detained, questioned, and quietly returned to his apartment like a fugitive wrongly released on a technicality. 12 days during which not a single apology was issued, not a single staff member addressed the incident, and not a single resident initiated so much as a casual hello in the elevator. The atmosphere had shifted from indifferent civility to orchestrated avoidance. He had become an anomaly in a place built on predictability, and though no one said it aloud, it was clear. The building wanted him gone. Or, at least, someone did. Daniel didn't retaliate with emotion. He had seen what happened to people who let insult guide their actions. Reactive responses invited escalation and gave the enemy angles to exploit. He did something far more dangerous. He studied, not as a paranoid recluse or vigilante with delusions of grandeur, but as a man who had once operated a company with over 200 employees, managed procurement negotiations with multinational distributors, and knew precisely how systems broke, from within. The board that governed the building was comprised of 5 members. 2 were retired lawyers, 1 a commercial architect, and the last, a wild card, was a dentist with far too much time on his hands. But the 5th, the head, the mouthpiece, the one who had filed the complaint that led to his detainment, was Karen Lynch. He started by pulling the publicly available meeting minutes posted to the building's internal portal. They were sanitized, polished summaries filled with non-committal language and vague committee actions. But in their vagueness, Daniel recognized patterns, terms like routine enforcement, security reevaluation, and special review of unit. Compliance appeared disproportionately in months when new residents arrived. The language was designed to obscure, not inform. It was governance not for transparency, but for insulation. And Karen's name appeared in every initiative involving access control, administrative oversight, or resident behavioral policy. Daniel didn't need to dig deeper alone. He called a contact from his legal counsel's office, an associate who specialized in residential policy analysis, and asked for a breakdown of their bylaw enforcement structure. Within 72 hours, the associate delivered a folder detailing the limits of the board's power. They could not restrict access to common areas without due process. They could not withhold service utilities or mailbox access, and they most certainly could not file external law enforcement complaints without documented violations. Everything they had done to him over the past 2 weeks was legally questionable, but it was buried under a mountain of procedure and plausible deniability, which is where Karen operated best. The situation escalated again when Daniel attempted to receive a delivery. A rare book he had ordered weeks earlier finally arrived and required signature confirmation. The courier reached the lobby, requested access to his floor, and was told that the resident was currently under review and unable to accept parcels directly. The package was rejected and returned to the depot. Daniel only found out after tracking the shipment manually and contacting the delivery service. When he approached the front desk, he was met with the same hollow smiles and procedural shrugs. "It must be a systems error," they said. But systems errors don't selectively target individual apartments. The next morning, Daniel received an envelope hand-delivered to his door. No return address. Inside was a printed notice informing him of continued infractions and the pending implementation of a formal warning letter, which, if not responded to, could lead to an administrative hearing. The letter contained no dates, no infractions, no specific events. Just a warning about non-collaborative conduct. Daniel didn't respond to the letter. Instead, he responded with movement. He hired a property analyst. Not a private investigator, but someone whose job was to audit the ownership structures of residential units for investors seeking legal leverage. The analyst, after a few days of discreet work, uncovered something interesting. Karen Lynch technically only owned one unit in the building, the one she lived in. But 6 years earlier, she had transferred an adjacent unit into a family trust that bore no publicly listed name, a move often used to protect property from legal claims or conceal conflicts of interest. That unit, according to records, had recently been listed for internal consideration. A euphemism Daniel knew meant it was about to go on private sale before ever reaching a public listing. This discovery aligned perfectly with something else he had uncovered. In the building's financial disclosures, a line item showed Karen as the recipient of a recurring committee incentive stipend. A modest amount that on its face appeared innocent, until Daniel cross-referenced it against the dates his own mailbox was disabled. The payment occurred within 48 hours of every enforcement incident involving a resident. It was small enough to be dismissed, but regular enough to indicate a pattern. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was financially incentivized to initiate disruption. Still, Daniel knew financial motive wasn't enough. If he wanted to shift the balance, he needed leverage, not just on paper, but on property. So he waited. The analyst monitored the status of the trust-owned unit daily. Meanwhile, Daniel contacted a broker who specialized in silent acquisitions. When the unit finally entered a private bidding window, Daniel was already registered under a limited partnership formed weeks earlier. The bid was submitted discreetly, efficiently, and accepted within 3 days. The deal would close in under 30. But Karen wasn't blind. Days before the deal closed, Daniel received a notice summoning him to yet another mandatory compliance review. This time, it was personal. He was to appear before the board, Karen presiding, to address escalating behavioral non-alignment. The letter cited patterns of social resistance, non-engagement with community standards, and a single line that stood out like a blade drawn, slowly from its sheath. Residents who fail to integrate jeopardize the harmony we have worked so hard to build. Daniel didn't attend. Instead, his lawyer submitted a cease and desist letter directly to the property management company, citing harassment, denial of service, and targeted punitive enforcement with no legal merit. A week later, the property manager, who until then had parroted every board decision, reached out personally. His tone was different this time, apologetic, measured. He said the board had perhaps overreached, and that certain administrative procedures would be reviewed. Daniel didn't ask for an apology. He didn't acknowledge the shift. He simply confirmed that his legal team would be monitoring all correspondence from that point forward. And then, quietly, with no announcements and no public listing, the unit, once owned by Karen's trust, changed hands. Daniel Raines now owned it. No one knew. Not yet, but Karen would, and when she did, the real shift in control would begin, not through confrontation or conflict, but through ownership, through presence, through strategic silence backed by undeniable force. He had been playing their game. Now the board was on his. The change didn't arrive with spectacle. There were no grand reveals, no public gestures, no announcements made at community gatherings. It entered the building like a quiet draft beneath a door, unnoticed at first, but steadily changing the temperature of everything it touched. Daniel Raines became a second name on a deed that no one questioned, because the transaction had been processed legally, privately, and without raising flags in the community's digital bulletin board or in whispers passed between residents in elevators. Yet, it altered the landscape more significantly than any petition or confrontation ever could. For the first time since moving in, Daniel was no longer just a resident. He was a fellow owner of more than just his unit and of more than just space. He now held footing in a structure that had been closed to him before, one protected by legal framing and real estate muscle rather than vague community principles. He didn't need to announce it, because people like Karen would feel it without explanation. And she did. Karen began to behave differently almost immediately after the transaction closed. The shift was minor at first, expressed in pauses that weren't there before, in her narrowed gaze when she passed Daniel in the lobby, in the way her questions during board discussions, shared in the few publicly posted minutes that Daniel still reviewed, took on a defensive tone instead of the usual curated certainty. She had sensed it. Not just change, but challenge. For someone like her, control wasn't about enforcement. It was about equilibrium that favored her. Daniel's move tilted that balance, and Karen wasn't yet sure how deep it would cut. The building itself, of course, remained physically unchanged. The walls held their polished stillness, the staff continued their quiet movements, and the plants in the atrium were still watered every second morning. But the rhythm of interaction began to stutter. One resident, an older gentleman on Daniel's floor who had once averted his eyes when passing, now offered a silent nod in the hallway. Another, Karen's own neighbor, stood talking longer than usual to a courier at the front desk, watching as Daniel walked by. It wasn't loyalty or alliance, not yet, but it was the first rupture in the wall of consensus that Karen had built over years. She felt it, even if she couldn't yet trace its origin to a single, quiet acquisition. Daniel didn't escalate anything directly. He didn't confront, didn't challenge, didn't walk into meetings uninvited or issue ultimatums. Instead, he simply requested, through his legal representative, a copy of the building's full procedural record on his earlier detainment and credential lockout. When the request was first denied, he followed with a formal public records inquiry directed at the property management company, this time attaching a statement from his legal team regarding procedural abuse. The message was clear. He had the means, the time, and the leverage to persist. not as a disruptor, but as an equal participant in the mechanisms Karen had long considered hers to direct. What followed was not a direct counterattack, but a series of tactical retreats. His name reappeared on the resident directory. His parking space was reinstated, not with apology, but with a neutral administrative update. The courier restrictions that had been quietly applied to his address were lifted, and when his dry cleaning service returned to using his proper floor code, he knew that someone had loosened their grip. The system hadn't admitted fault. It had simply begun erasing the fingerprints of its own overreach. Karen, however, couldn't erase hers so easily. During a routine community forum hosted in the main lounge, a quarterly affair more performative than practical, Karen was notably sharper, her voice just a degree too tight when discussing unit responsibility, her tone more brittle when outlining changes to access policy reviews. And when a resident tentatively asked about the selection process for new committee seats, a question no one would have dared pose a month earlier, Karen deflected with a clipped, "that falls under board jurisdiction." The room was quiet, but the silence didn't carry the usual weight of agreement. It carried a curiosity. Later that week, Daniel passed by the conference room where Karen was meeting with the property manager. He didn't slow down, didn't stop, but he caught the angle of her posture, the quick motion of her hand across the table. She wasn't relaxed. She wasn't in control. She was cornered by the very process she had used to keep others on edge. But the true inflection point came, unexpectedly, from outside. The building received a notice from the city's Administrative Housing Committee. A random compliance audit had been scheduled. It wasn't tied to Daniel, wasn't instigated by any party directly involved, but its arrival at this precise time created panic among the committee members. Karen, accustomed to internal control, now faced an external set of eyes she couldn't influence. Documentation had to be produced. Procedure had to be followed. And Daniel, now a co-owner of record, was entitled to attend any sessions involving shared property concerns. He didn't attend the audit meetings himself. He sent a proxy, his real estate attorney, impeccably dressed with a quiet smile and a briefcase full of receipts, copies of correspondence, and legally framed questions. The building passed the audit, technically, but notes were made. Red flags were filed, not violations but annotations about administrative ambiguity, about irregularities in enforcement consistency. For a complex like this one, whose value rested as much on its stability as its location, those notations carried weight. Investors noticed, owners noticed, and Karen noticed. Daniel didn't celebrate. He remained quiet, composed, but now unmistakably visible. When he passed through the lobby, the security guards no longer hesitated. The staff greeted him again by name. The neutrality returned, but this time it wasn't dismissal. It was respect. Karen's control hadn't broken, but it had cracked. And in a building like this, cracks weren't just flaws. They were futures. Daniel knew now he didn't need to expose her, didn't need to wage war. He simply needed to wait, own, and press. Not publicly, not loudly, but precisely. Karen had made her play through intimidation and social pressure. Daniel had made his through acquisition and process. And while the residents still whispered and the walls still watched, the balance had changed. This wasn't just about a condo anymore. It was about who the building would listen to when both sides knocked. It started with the elevator again. Not with a mechanical fault or a power outage. Daniel would have recognized those as operational failures and moved on, but with a restriction. On an otherwise quiet Thursday morning, after a run through his usual route along the river trail, Daniel returned to the building and pressed the button for the 21st floor. The elevator didn't move. Instead, a soft chime sounded, and a new screen appeared. Restricted access. Floor temporarily unavailable due to scheduled maintenance. He tried again. Same result. No alerts had been sent, no notices posted. The concierge looked up when Daniel approached, hesitated, and said he wasn't informed of any maintenance today but would look into it. Daniel didn't respond. He already knew what this was. A message, a warning. Not from the building itself, but from Karen, whose grip on procedural levers was weakening but far from broken. That evening, the lights in the hallway outside his unit flickered twice, then went dark. Emergency bulbs kicked in 5 seconds later. Daniel noted the time. Then he opened his secure home server, pulled up the building utility grid map he'd obtained months earlier through a third-party technical consultant, and saw the anomaly. A manual override had been issued from the maintenance console on the 4th floor, a floor that housed nothing but storage and admin service points. It wasn't accidental. It was staged interference designed to unsettle, but more importantly, to test his response. Karen was shifting tactics. Where once she relied on official channels and board-backed authority, now she was operating in the margins. Disruption without accountability. Enforcement without traceability. Daniel recognized this kind of pressure from his corporate years, the kind of behavior that emerged when power began slipping and desperation set in. The problem for Karen was that Daniel wasn't just a passive victim of her aggression anymore. He had become a calculated participant in the conflict, with resources and patience far exceeding hers. Within 48 hours, he responded. Not through retaliation, but through recalibration. He had his proxy legal team issue a formal request to the property management company, this time not as a complaint, but as a liability inquiry. It included questions about emergency lighting compliance, elevator override protocols, and access log permissions. The tone was neutral, even cooperative, but the message behind it was unmistakable. He was documenting everything, and if something happened, anything, that put him or his property at risk, the legal repercussions would be structural, not personal. Karen didn't respond directly, but the complex did. The following Monday, Daniel received a thin, impersonal letter informing him that all board-related administrative concerns will now be handled exclusively through formal committee channels, and that unsanctioned legal inquiries regarding infrastructure must be directed to third-party building counsel. It was a preemptive containment move, an attempt to reroute and dilute his inquiries. But Daniel had anticipated this. He wasn't interested in administrative engagement. He was setting precedent step by step. And then came the first overt act of aggression since his acquisition. A letter arrived, not under his door this time, but taped to it with blue painter's tape, subtle enough to avoid damaging property, bold enough to be unmistakably deliberate. The paper bore no signature, no official header. It read, "There is still time to avoid formal escalation. Return to neutral standing. Withdraw your inquiry. This is not personal. Don't let it become so." The note was typed, plain, but Daniel knew the tone. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a warning from someone whose network had always kept her insulated from challenge, until now. Daniel made no public response, but privately he escalated. He contacted the broker who had helped him acquire the first unit and instructed him to begin tracking any property linked to Karen, active or pending, in the building or its immediate affiliates. Daniel had no intention of waging a financial war, but he was preparing the battlefield. If Karen attempted to reconsolidate her influence through property manipulation, he would be there first. Meanwhile, he began researching election procedures for the board. It turned out that the next term cycle was coming up in 6 months, and that any current owner with 2 or more units could nominate a proxy to run. Daniel didn't intend to serve, but he could certainly nominate someone who would. The nomination process was straightforward, the requirements clearly outlined. But the environment was hostile. Whispers had begun circulating among residents. Rumors that Daniel was planning to corporatize the building, that he was positioning himself to take over the management structure. Karen's allies were spinning a quiet narrative of invasion and loss of community. But Daniel, once again, refused to take the bait. He didn't respond with statements or attempts to defend himself. Instead, he invited a compliance oversight consultant, one with former municipal auditing experience, to conduct a third-party review of the building's governance processes. No. His justification was simple. As an investor, he needed to understand how the place was being run. The consultant arrived a week later, met discreetly with the property manager, and submitted a confidential evaluation. Daniel never shared the contents, but Karen found out. She always did. It was the final trigger. One morning, 2 weeks later, Daniel returned from a trip to find his door handle scratched and his mailbox ajar. Nothing was taken, nothing damaged beyond cosmetic irritation. But it was the first physical incursion. He notified the police, not with emotion or drama, but with cold precision. He requested a report, cited the security cameras in the hallway, and handed over a USB drive containing his floor's surveillance backup, which he had been logging independently since the first maintenance error. The officer on duty didn't promise much. Buildings like this rarely faced serious consequences for internal pettiness. But the fact that Daniel had a complete visual timeline altered the dynamic. The officer noted that the footage would be reviewed. Karen was officially under scrutiny now, even if anonymously. Then Daniel moved again. He posted a formal nomination for a new board proxy, an articulate, composed resident named Malcolm Chen, a quiet professional with a background in nonprofit logistics who had lived in the building for over a decade and had long kept to himself. Malcolm was respected, neutral, and visibly uninterested in politics. But behind the scenes, Daniel had briefed him on everything. Malcolm agreed, reluctantly, after reviewing the documents and seeing the scale of procedural erosion. His platform wasn't about revenge. It was about oversight. Karen countered the nomination by proposing a rule change, that only active community members be eligible for board consideration, citing undefined thresholds of participation. But this time, the rest of the board didn't fall in line immediately. Too many things had accumulated. Too many irregularities had become public. And Daniel's quiet precision had infected the environment with doubt. It culminated in a community meeting held in the conference room. Karen, seated at the head, opened with the usual rote address, welcoming everyone, emphasizing unity, but her voice trembled slightly when she began reading the agenda. When the topic of the nomination process surfaced, she opened the floor for questions. A younger resident, someone Daniel didn't know, raised a hand and asked plainly, "How are we defining community involvement? Are there minutes that outline what counts and what doesn't?" Karen flinched. She tried to redirect, but the question hung in the room. Another voice followed. "And how come our last 3 policy updates weren't posted online? I heard they were hand-distributed to only some residents." The room shifted. People leaned forward. Eyes began to scan. Daniel remained silent. He didn't need to speak. The moment was happening without him, just as he had designed it. By the end of the meeting, the vote to consider the new proxy passed by a narrow margin. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was the first step toward a rebalancing. Karen exited the meeting quickly, not waiting to shake hands. Her power was still present, but its edges were dulling, its reach contracting. Daniel returned to his unit that night and opened the second drawer of his filing cabinet. Inside were copies of every letter he'd received, every document he'd sent, every timestamp and footage sample from the last 6 months. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt prepared. There were still battles ahead. But the war had already changed shape. And Karen, whether she admitted it or not, was no longer fighting on home ground. The final shift didn't announce itself with confrontation or direct accusations. It came as a steady, tightening grip on the spaces Karen once moved through with unchallenged authority. It was the slow collapse of an environment no longer responding to her voice in the same synchronized fashion. The building she had controlled for years, where residents once complied out of fear or habit, had begun to look at her differently. Not with open hostility, Karen was too entrenched for that, but with caution, with the suspicion reserved for those whose power had become unstable. And in a system built on perception, instability was the beginning of the end. It started with small administrative breakdowns. A scheduled fire drill Karen had personally organized was postponed due to a sudden permit inconsistency, which Daniel's consultant later traced to a missing fire code update she had overlooked months prior. Then, during a monthly maintenance briefing, the head custodian, a man Karen had always treated like an obedient fixture, openly corrected her during a presentation on emergency exit upgrades. He hadn't done it with malice, just matter-of-fact precision. But the room had noticed. Karen's usual grip on the rhythm of these meetings, her skill at directing attention away from gaps, was slipping. And Daniel knew why. Behind the scenes, the weight of Daniel's documentation had begun its quiet assault on the structural fabric of her influence. Though he hadn't filed a formal complaint to the city's housing authority, he had let the right legal observers know that multiple residents, himself included, were preparing to review whether the building's operations met state and local residential standards. These were not threats, merely inquiries. Questions framed in the calm legal language that didn't spark confrontation but forced procedural clarity. And clarity, Karen had learned, was her enemy. Her strength had always been in murkiness, in rules interpreted through authority rather than law, in a culture of compliance born from intimidation cloaked in etiquette. But what she hadn't anticipated was that Daniel wasn't interested in replacing her. He wasn't campaigning for recognition, wasn't asking for support. He was simply continuing to expand his foothold, legally, silently, and with an unshakable consistency. A second property fell under his ownership. This time, not even through proxy but direct purchase after a family from out of state decided to sell quietly. His presence in the internal registries grew, not just as a resident but as a multiple-unit owner, a classification that entitled him to different rights in meetings, elections, and procedural challenges. He had moved from participant to stakeholder. And now, everyone else could see it too. Karen's last move was designed not as a legal maneuver but as a psychological attack. At the following board session, closed to residents but open to proxies, she introduced a resolution aimed at limiting conflict-prone entities from influencing multiple administrative processes simultaneously. The language was vague, almost philosophical, crafted to sound like a proposal for fairness. But Daniel's representative, who had full access under ownership rights, was already prepared. He rose and calmly asked the board whether they intended to retroactively restrict voting access based on anonymous and unproven classifications. The room fell quiet. One member, a former ally of Karen, looked uncomfortable. The motion stalled. Karen withdrew it without further comment. That night, a new notice appeared in the building's central hallway, signed by the property manager. Due to ongoing resident complaints and concerns regarding administrative transparency, a special advisory committee would be formed to review board policies. Residents were invited to nominate candidates by the end of the month. The notice was standard, dry, and procedural, but its message was unmistakable. Karen's authority was no longer absolute. The building itself was calling for a second voice. It was the next morning, during an unremarkable elevator ride, that Karen finally broke the silence. Daniel entered on the ground floor, pressed the button for his level, and found Karen already inside. She didn't greet him immediately. Instead, she watched the numbers light up. Then, without turning her head, she spoke. You've undone years of stability for what? To prove a point? Daniel didn't answer. She turned to face him. You don't understand what this building needs. It's not just rules and policies. It's consistency. People feel safe here because they know what to expect. Daniel met her gaze. They expect fairness. That's all. Karen laughed, sharp, mirthless. Fairness is a myth people believe when they don't understand how systems work. This place isn't built on fairness. It's built on control. Without it, things fall apart. The elevator chimed. His floor. Daniel stepped out. Then maybe it's time it learned to stand without it. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. What followed was almost anticlimactic. The property management firm issued a notice calling for administrative restructuring of the advisory roles. Karen's title was suspended pending review. Officially, she hadn't been removed, just reassigned, her influence reduced to that of any other long-standing resident. But those who had lived under her authority for years understood what the language meant. Daniel didn't celebrate. He didn't host meetings or join the new committees forming around the advisory board. He didn't post in the resident forums or attend the community brunch held to reaffirm shared values. He simply returned to his routine: early morning walks, black coffee at the cafe on the corner, and evenings spent reading, quietly in his office overlooking the skyline. But now, when he passed through the lobby, no one avoided him. The security staff greeted him without hesitation. Maintenance workers nodded without fear of reprisal. The residents, especially the older ones, began to make eye contact again. Some even stopped to talk. Karen remained in her unit. For a while, at least. Rumors circulated that she had put it on the market through a private agency. No listing ever appeared, but then again, people like Karen didn't leave loudly. They disappeared through quiet exits, hoping that their absence would be interpreted as dignified withdrawal rather than defeat. Daniel didn't concern himself with when she would go. She already had. In the weeks that followed Karen's quiet fall from authority, the atmosphere in the building settled into something Daniel had not quite expected. Not celebration, not vindication, but a kind of composed neutrality. The artificial order she had maintained for so long had fractured, but chaos had not rushed in to replace it. Instead, a strange calm descended, not unlike the silence after a heavy storm, when everything is still wet and heavy but undeniably cleansed. People walked through the halls a little slower. Conversations emerged in corners where previously only nods had sufficed. And for the first time since Daniel had moved in, the staff seemed to operate without the invisible pressure of watching eyes. It was not that Karen had been hated. On the contrary, many had simply learned to operate under her framework because there had never been another model. She had filled a vacuum with discipline, and the residents, like any system, had adapted to the shape of control. Now, in the wake of her absence, a rebalancing was occurring, one without banners or meetings, just human behavior shifting naturally in the open space she had left behind. Daniel didn't speak of it to anyone. He maintained his habits, greeted people politely, paid his maintenance fees early, and walked past the front desk with the same quiet assurance he had always carried. But where once he was met with guarded glances, now he received measured acknowledgement. Nods, smiles, even the occasional comment about the weather or the coffee shop on 3rd Street. The small things that indicated not allegiance, but normalization. He had become, at last, just another fixture in the building, no longer a disruption to be contained, but a presence that simply was. And that, more than any vote or legal notice, marked the real end of the conflict. Karen was still there, technically. Her unit remained dark most evenings, the blinds drawn, the door untouched. Packages stopped arriving. Her name disappeared from the sign-up sheets for building events. She no longer appeared in the elevator, no longer stood near the lobby observing who came and went. At some point, her unit was listed quietly through a private broker. The sale was not announced, and when the new owners moved in, a couple in their early 40s, quiet, polite, no one mentioned her name. She had exited the same way she had governed, through the manipulation of systems, through silence, through the slow, precise application of rules that no longer applied. Daniel received the final confirmation in the mail 2 weeks later, a sealed envelope from the building's management firm informing him that the restructuring of the administrative committee had been finalized. There were no references to Karen or to prior conflicts, only a polite acknowledgement that the advisory structure had been updated, that ownership verification had been streamlined, and that unit owners with multiple properties were now entitled to direct access to board minutes and policy proposals. It was a small shift, administrative in nature, but it meant something significant. It meant that his presence had not only been acknowledged but incorporated into the framework. He had not just resisted the system, he had changed it, without drama, without spectacle, and without ever raising his voice. He placed the letter in a folder, filed it under Building Documents, and closed the drawer. Then he returned to his living room, where the afternoon light cut across the hardwood in soft lines, and sat in the same chair he had been sitting in the day Karen had first spoken to him in the elevator. He didn't think of her now, not with malice, not with triumph, but simply as a chapter concluded. There was no satisfaction in her absence, only the relief of resolution. She had been powerful because the building had allowed her to be, and she had fallen not because he had destroyed her, but because she had failed to see the limits of her influence when challenged by someone unwilling to play by her rules. Outside, a delivery truck pulled up. The driver stepped out, walked to the lobby, and was let in without incident. Daniel watched through the window, not with suspicion, but with quiet appreciation. The building was functioning again, not perfectly but smoothly. People moved as they pleased. Questions were asked without fear. The illusion of control had been replaced by something more durable: balance. Later that evening, as he returned from his usual walk, Daniel paused in the lobby. The concierge, a young man who had once hesitated to even hand him mail, greeted him with a genuine smile and asked how his day had been. Daniel answered simply, and the two exchanged a few words before parting. No tension, no hesitation, just the calm professionalism that should have been there from the start. As he stepped into the elevator, alone, he glanced briefly at the mirrored walls, saw the reflection of a man who had not become something new, but had merely refused to become something else. He pressed the button for his floor and stood still as the doors closed. No noise, no resistance, no Karen, just the quiet hum of a system, finally, working as it should.